How can a fragile soul grow into a light so enduring that its love continues transforming hearts long after death? Dear listener, wherever you find yourself tonight, settle into a gentle stillness and let this shared moment bring us together. Please subscribe and join our quiet journey of grace now. This is the story of Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus, whose hidden life of trust and small sacrifices blossomed into a powerful stream of grace, revealing how love offered humbly can touch the world in ways unseen yet enduring. And so, with that quiet invitation resting in your heart, the story opens in the soft light of a small French town. Alençon, in the middle years of the 19th century, was a place of gentle rhythms, lace-making workshops, and quiet cobblestone streets where footsteps echoed like soft prayers. It was here, on a cool morning in early January of 1873, that a child was born who would one day be known as the Little Flower. Her birth name was Marie-Françoise Thérèse Martin, but to the world she would become Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus, a hidden soul destined to radiate a love whose fragrance would spread far beyond the walls of her home and the cloister she would later embrace. In the Martin household, faith was the air they breathed. Louis Martin, her father, carried a quiet dignity, shaped by both discipline and tenderness. Her mother, Zélie, was a woman whose hands worked lace with delicate precision, yet whose heart was wide enough to hold each of her children with deep, unwavering affection. Their union formed a sanctuary of love where daily life was softened by prayer, sacrifice, and a sense of God's presence woven through the simplest tasks. Into this sanctuary, Thérèse arrived as the youngest of 9 children, though only 5 survived infancy. She was tiny, delicate, and luminous, with that rare sensitivity that makes some children seem as though they hear a music the rest of us overlook. Even as an infant, she warmed to tenderness and withdrew from harshness, responding to the world with a soul already predisposed to love. The early years of her life glowed with that gentle serenity that only a deeply united family can offer. Zélie delighted in her new daughter, often writing letters that captured the sweet simplicity of Thérèse's nature. She described her as affectionate, lively, and unusually attuned to the emotional climate around her. It was as though Thérèse instinctively sensed the currents flowing between people, noticing what pleased, what hurt, and what healed. Her sisters, Marie, Pauline, Léonie, and Céline, surrounded her with warmth, and her father often lifted her into his arms with a tenderness that would later become one of the defining memories of her childhood. Each day in the Martin household unfolded with predictable grace. The family prayed together, worked diligently, and sought to live in harmony with God's will. They attended Mass with devotion, encountered life's duties with serenity, and welcomed small joys without clinging to them. All these habits would become the foundation of Thérèse's later spiritual path, the soil in which her little way would take root. Even before she spoke clearly, she absorbed a worldview shaped not by grand gestures, but by quiet love offered generously. As Thérèse grew from infancy into early childhood, her personality blossomed in a way that both delighted and concerned her parents. She had an intensity of feeling that made her joys radiant, but her sorrows heartbreakingly deep. A simple smile from her beloved mother could send her into fits of laughter, while a sharp tone or moment of separation could reduce her to tears. Some would call such sensitivity a weakness, but in Thérèse it revealed a heart designed for great love. What else, after all, is sensitivity but the soul's way of opening itself to the world more deeply than others dare to do? Thérèse's early experiences taught her to cling to those she loved with a devotion that was tender and wholehearted. She followed her sisters around the house, curling into their laps, seeking reassurance through their presence. With her father, she felt completely safe, often walking beside him during his quiet evening strolls or waiting for him at the window as he returned from his shop. He called her his little queen, and her trust in him helped shape her first intuition of God as gentle, protective, and intimately close. But even amid such sweetness, life gently prepared her for deeper truths. Her mother's illness began to cast faint shadows over the household. Though Therese was too young to understand, she sensed the growing fragility in the woman who held her each morning and soothed her each night. Children often perceive sorrow not through explanations, but through changes in tone, in the heaviness of footsteps, in the sudden silence that falls over a room. Thérèse, with her delicate heart, absorbed all these subtle shifts, yet even these shadows carried a quiet grace, for they taught her early that love does not mean the absence of suffering, but the willingness to remain tender through it. There were small moments when the seeds of her later spirituality stirred quietly within her. When she misbehaved, her corrections came not through anger, but through gentle reminders that God watched over her and desired her to grow in goodness. These early lessons shaped her imagination in profound ways. She did not imagine God as distant or demanding, but as close, loving, delighted by small acts of kindness and obedience. Later, when she would formulate her little way, she would remember her childhood lessons, not as doctrinal teachings, but as memories of a father who wanted nothing more than to be loved with childlike trust. Her earliest prayers were simple and spontaneous. Sometimes she folded her small hands and whispered words she barely understood, imitating her mother and sisters. At other times, she simply gazed at a crucifix or statue as though trying to understand the silent love hidden within it. She absorbed beauty with a contemplative instinct rare in children, sunlight filtering through the window, the quiet rustle of fabric as her mother worked, the soft murmur of evening prayers. All of these became part of her interior landscape, forming a heart that found God not only in sacred moments, but in the texture of daily life. Even the town of Alençon played a quiet role in shaping her spirit. Its narrow streets, modest gardens, and simple stone homes created a backdrop of peaceful predictability. The Martins were neither wealthy nor poor, but occupied the humble middle ground where virtues like simplicity, diligence, and modesty flourish naturally. In this environment, Thérèse learned to cherish ordinary blessings: fresh bread, blooming flowers, the laughter of her sisters, the comfort of family gatherings. Her later spirituality, which emphasized holiness in small acts, was seated here long before she could articulate it. Yet, for all the serenity of her early years, one could sense that her soul was already inclined towards something more. There was a depth in her gaze, a tenderness in her way of reaching for others that hinted at a future shaped by grace. Some children seem destined for extraordinary paths not because of remarkable talents, but because their hearts beat with an unusual openness to love. Thérèse was such a child. Though she did not yet know it, her life was already bending gently toward the mystery of God, like a flower turning toward the sun, without ever being taught how. And so, in these earliest years, before sorrow would deepen her faith and before the cloister would claim her as its own, Thérèse lived simply as a little girl in a home filled with affection and light. Her story was only beginning, but already the fragrance of holiness was gathering quietly around her, like the first hint of a rose that will one day bloom in fullness. And as the child grows within this gentle cradle of love, what first sorrow will begin shaping her into the saint she is destined to become? And so, as the gentle cradle of Thérèse's early childhood rocked softly in the warmth of Alençon, life prepared to open a new and more solemn chapter, one that would leave an imprint upon her soul so deep that its echo would resound throughout her spiritual journey. For no childhood, however blessed, remains untouched by sorrow, and it is often in those first fragile encounters with loss that the heart learns its earliest lessons in trust and surrender. Little Thérèse, with her tender nature and luminous gaze, was about to face the moment that would shape the contours of her inner life, the passing of her beloved mother, Zélie. The year was 1877, And Therese was just 4 years old when the slow shadow of illness, which had hovered quietly over the family, began to settle more heavily upon their home. Zélie, who had suffered for years from an undiagnosed breast cancer, carried her pain with remarkable patience and an almost serene acceptance, continuing the rhythms of daily life for as long as her weakening strength allowed. Yet children sense more than adults often realize. Thérèse observed the tiredness in her mother's eyes, the way conversations shifted to hushed tones, the subtle transformations in the household atmosphere. She did not understand the nature of the illness, but her delicate heart felt the tremors of sorrow long before the final blow fell. When Zélie's condition worsened, she and Louis sought care in the hope that a change in climate might offer relief. But her illness had progressed too far. In August of that year, surrounded by her loved ones, Zélie Martin surrendered her life into God's hands. The grief that flooded the household was as deep as it was quiet, for the Martins were accustomed to bearing sorrow with dignity. But for little Thérèse, the loss was not just the absence of a mother, it was the breaking of a world. Her mother had been the anchor of her tender heart, the one whose gentle arms held her, whose voice comforted her, whose very presence communicated safety and love. To lose such a figure at the age of 4 was a wound that pierced her with bewilderment. It was said later that the moment of her mother's death became the foundational sorrow of her life, carving out in her heart both a well of tenderness and a vulnerability that never fully disappeared. For days, the little girl wandered as though searching for something she could not name. She pressed herself into her sister's arms, clinging to them with an almost desperate need for reassurance. Those who watched her in those days would later recall how the child's face seemed to reflect a sorrow that exceeded her years, as though she understood on some mysterious level that she had lost more than she could grasp. Her father, Louis, grieving the wife he had cherished so deeply, gathered his daughters and made the decision to leave Alençon. The family would begin anew in Lisieux, where Zélie's relatives lived, and so they packed their belongings, and with heavy hearts they left the home that had been filled with laughter, prayers, and the small joys that Zélie's love had created. The journey to Lisieux marked a turning point not only in location, but in the formation of Thérèse's soul. For it was there, in the quiet town with its tree-lined avenues and gentle landscapes, that her spiritual life would deepen under the influence of her sisters and her father's unwavering devotion to God. In Lisieux, the sisters took on motherly roles in ways far beyond their years. Pauline, especially, became for little Thérèse the new source of comfort, affection, and guidance. The child attached herself to Pauline with the intensity of one who, having lost once, clings all the more fiercely to what remains. She followed her everywhere, seeking the closeness that would soothe her loneliness. But even surrounded by love, the wound of her mother's absence continued to throb beneath the surface. Children often grieve in ways that are subtle yet profound, and for Thérèse, the grief manifested itself in a heightened sensitivity. Small slights wounded her easily. Separations caused her deep anxiety. Even a change in tone from someone she loved could bring her to tears. But this same sensitivity also fostered the beginnings of compassion. She noticed the sufferings of others. She felt drawn to comfort those in pain. For her, sorrow was not simply a personal burden. It became a school of empathy, teaching her to recognize what tenderness people long for when their hearts are breaking. Louis, ever gentle and attentive, did everything in his power to fill the void left by Zélie. He walked with his daughters through the fields, teaching them to look for God in the beauty of nature. He prayed with them, shared stories, and created moments of quiet joy that helped slowly rebuild their sense of security. At times he would lift Thérèse into his arms and hold her for long moments, as though aware that his embrace was doing the work of two parents. She, in turn, adored him with a devotion that would later influence her most cherished image of God, a tender, loving father whose arms are always open. As years passed, the intensity of the raw grief softened, but its imprint remained. Thérèse would later say that the death of her mother had made her overly sensitive, prone to tears, and deeply reliant on the affection of those she loved. And yet, even in this fragility, grace worked quietly. For in the vulnerable heart of a grieving child, God was planting the seeds of the little way, a path of trust, humility, and surrender that would one day guide countless souls. Her childhood sorrow became the soil in which her future spiritual strength would grow. At times she wondered, in her own simple way, why God had allowed her mother to be taken so soon. But even then she did not accuse or rebel. Instead, she held fast to the idea that God was still holding her, that somehow her mother's love continued in ways unseen. In moments of loneliness, she would whisper her thoughts to God with childlike simplicity, asking Him to help her become good, to comfort her heart, and to watch over her family. Her prayers were not elaborate. They were sincere, sprung from the depth of a young soul learning to find refuge in the divine. As Thérèse grew, she began to reflect, even as a child, on the mystery of suffering. How could love and sorrow dwell so closely together? How could the same God who filled her heart with warmth also permit it to be wounded so deeply? These early questions did not darken her faith. Instead, they deepened it. She learned that love does not protect us from suffering. It guides us through it. And in this quiet understanding, her heart was being prepared for the deeper trials and greater graces that would come in later years. Her mother's death also awakened in her a longing for heaven that would remain with her throughout her life. To her young mind, heaven was not an abstract concept, but a place where her mother had gone ahead, waiting for her. This longing did not pull her away from life. It infused her daily actions with a desire to grow in virtue so that she might one day be reunited with the mother she loved so dearly. Thus, the sorrow that filled her early childhood was not wasted. It became the beginning of her transformation, teaching her that even the deepest wounds can become openings for grace. Loss became longing, and longing became love. And as this tender longing deepened within her young heart, what quiet flame of faith would begin to rise and strengthen her from within? And as this tender longing deepened within her young heart, what quiet flame of faith would begin to rise and strengthen her from within? Lisieux, with its gentle hills and narrow streets softened by morning mist, became the setting for the next shaping season of Thérèse's childhood. Though she still carried the wound of her mother's absence, her soul was slowly learning to breathe through the ache, finding in faith a comfort deeper than anything the world could offer. For children often draw near to God not because they understand doctrine or theology, but because something in their hearts recognizes a familiar presence, a warmth that feels like home. And in Thérèse, whose sensitivity remained as delicate as a rose petal touched by dew, that instinctive pull toward God began to rise with unmistakable clarity. Life in Lisieux settled into a rhythm steady and nurturing. The Martin family, now under the loving guidance of Pauline and Marie, maintained the habits of prayer and devotion that had always defined them. Their home on the Rue Saint-Blaise filled with the gentle murmur of evening prayers, the flicker of candlelight before small icons, and the daily offering of work done with quiet fidelity. These patterns formed the invisible architecture of Thérèse's days. They shaped her interior life in ways she could not yet articulate, teaching her to turn to God not as a distant judge, but as a loving companion who walked beside her through every joy and sorrow. Her father, Louis, played an especially crucial role in this awakening. In the years following Zélie's death, his grief deepened his tenderness toward his daughters, particularly toward his youngest. He would take Thérèse on quiet walks through the countryside, pointing out the beauty hidden in small things, a cluster of wildflowers, the way sunlight draped itself across the fields, the soft hum of bees gathering nectar. To Louis, Nature was a living book of God's love, and Thérèse absorbed these lessons with the trust of a child whose heart was eager to love and be loved. It was during these moments that her earliest images of God took shape, not as a stern figure enthroned in the heavens, but as a father tender and gentle like the man whose hand she held. At home, Thérèse's devotion found expression in small gestures. She loved playing with her sisters, arranging little altars, and imitating their pious routines with a charm that was both earnest and innocent. Her innate sensitivity, though still a source of tears and anxieties, also made her alert to the emotional needs of her family. She would comfort a sister who seemed sad or offer a smile to brighten her father's mood. She did not yet realize that these small acts of love foreshadowed the essence of her future spirituality. But in her simple, spontaneous kindness, the seeds of her little way were beginning to sprout. Still, her sensitivity often turned against her. She experienced episodes of intense scrupulosity, a kind of spiritual anxiety in which she feared displeasing God through even the smallest faults. A single harsh word or a moment of impatience could make her burst into tears. But these moments were not rooted in fear of punishment. Rather, they sprang from her deep desire to be good, to love God perfectly, and to avoid any action that might cause sorrow. Such sensitivity might have crushed another child under the weight of self-criticism. But for Thérèse, these struggles became stepping stones. They taught her to rely not on her own strength, but on the mercy of God, whom she imagined as a loving father, always ready to pick up his child after a fall. In this period of her life, Pauline became her spiritual lighthouse. Firm yet gentle, she guided Thérèse with wisdom that both comforted and challenged her. Pauline's example of faith inspired the little girl to imitate her virtues. When Pauline prayed, Thérèse watched. When Pauline read spiritual books, Thérèse listened. When Pauline spoke of God's love, Thérèse absorbed every word. In her eyes, Pauline was not merely an older sister. She was a model of holiness, a window through which the young girl glimpsed the beauty of a life dedicated entirely to God. And so a desire began to stir within her, still faint and unformed, but unmistakably present. A desire to belong completely to God, to give herself to Him with a love that knew no reserve. Yet for all this devotion, Thérèse was still a child at heart, playful, affectionate, imaginative. She enjoyed simple pleasures with an intensity that revealed her love for life, collecting flowers, playing make-believe, delighting in family gatherings. Her spirituality did not pull her away from childhood. Instead, it sanctified it. To her, climbing onto her father's lap, offering her toys to a sister, or praying a simple Hail Mary were all part of the same offering. Everything, joys, tears, laughter, fears, became gifts she offered to God with childlike trust. Years later, when she would write her autobiography, she would recall these early experiences with tender gratitude, recognizing them as the earliest steps of her spiritual journey. But as she grew older, another sorrow began to take shape, different from the loss of her mother, but just as piercing. Pauline, the sister she loved most deeply, announced that she felt called to enter the Carmelite convent. For Thérèse, who saw Pauline as both mother and spiritual guide, the thought of losing her again was almost unbearable. Her sensitive heart trembled at the prospect of separation. Yet, even in this pain, something changed. Instead of collapsing into despair, she found herself turning more consciously toward God. It was as though Pauline's departure invited Thérèse to place her trust not in any earthly relationship, but in the one who would never leave her. The day Pauline entered Carmel was a turning point. Though tears flowed freely, something firm and luminous awakened within Thérèse. She felt her heart stretching, painfully, yes, but also expansively. Later, she would say that this sorrow marked the beginning of her spiritual maturity. She realized that love sometimes means letting go, surrendering what is most precious into the hands of God. And though she was still a child, she embraced this lesson with surprising depth. She would visit Pauline at the convent grill, speaking to her through the wooden bars. At first, the separation stung like a reopened wound, but slowly the convent became for Thérèse not a place of loss, but a place of longing, a horizon toward which her soul began to lean. This longing was not yet the conscious desire for religious life. It was something more subtle, like the whisper of a breeze that hints at an approaching season. But it softened her heart, clarifying her intuition that God was shaping something within her, something small yet powerful, like a seed preparing to bloom. Her prayers became more deliberate, her conversations with God more intimate. She began offering small sacrifices, hiding them even from her sisters, wanting only God to see. She sensed that He was calling her to love Him with a purity that demanded trust, humility, and simplicity. Little by little, her childhood faith crystallized into a vision, still fragile, still forming, but radiant with promise. She understood that God was not asking her for grand gestures, but for small acts done with great love. And in her young, tender heart, she was already whispering her yes. And as her heart learned these early lessons of trust, what grace would soon arrive to transform her from within and strengthen her for the journey ahead. And as her heart learned these early lessons of trust, what grace would soon arrive to transform her from within and strengthen her for the journey ahead. Childhood, for all its beauty, often holds within it a fragile tension between innocence and vulnerability. And for Thérèse, this tension grew heavier as she approached adolescence. Her sensitivity, already sharp, deepened into a kind of trembling interior fragility that made even small disappointments feel overwhelming. She suffered from bouts of anxiety, sudden tears, and a sense of being swallowed by her emotions. Though surrounded by love, she often felt as though she were standing on unsteady ground. Every correction wounded her. Every separation from those she loved caused a disproportionate ache. Yet through all this, a quiet longing persisted, a longing for peace, for strength, for a heart unburdened by its own sensitivities. It was a longing God was already preparing to satisfy in the most unexpected way. The turning point began with another sorrow. When Thérèse was 9, Pauline, the sister who had been her spiritual mother, her guide, her sanctuary, left for the Carmelite convent in Lisieux. Losing her mother at 4 had pierced her heart, but losing Pauline reopened the wound in an even deeper way. It was as though the delicate structure of her soul trembled once more under the weight of absence. For months following Pauline's departure, Thérèse's already tender heart grew increasingly unstable. She wept easily, even uncontrollably. She suffered from mysterious fevers and nervous trembling. A simple anxiety could escalate into days of emotional exhaustion. Physicians offered no meaningful remedy. Her family, especially her father and sisters, prayed fervently for her healing, unsure how to help the child who seemed so lost in the labyrinth of her own emotions. But grace was quietly drawing near. During this season of fragility, a small statue of the Virgin Mary in her room became the focal point of her deepest prayers. Each night she gazed at it with a longing that mingled sorrow with hope. She begged Our Lady for strength, for peace, for some kind of inner transformation. There were moments when she felt a strange warmth while praying, as though Mary were watching over her with a maternal tenderness that filled the emptiness left by Zélie and Pauline. Her sisters, seeing her distress, encouraged her to persevere, reminding her that God often permits darkness before flooding the soul with light. Then, on Christmas night in 1886, everything changed. Earlier that evening, she had returned from midnight mass with her family. At 13 years old, she was still struggling with childish oversensitivity, still easily wounded, still prone to tears. Her father, tired and unaware of how fragile she remained, made an offhand remark about her lingering childishness, not knowing Thérèse had overheard him. In the past, such a comment would have shattered her into tears and self-reproach. But on that holy night, something unexpected stirred within her. Instead of collapsing into sorrow, she felt a sudden rush of strength, deep, quiet, luminous, rising from the very core of her being. She later described it as an instantaneous healing, a divine touch that freed her from the heavy cloud of sensitivity that had overshadowed her for years. It was not that she became emotionless, rather, her emotions no longer controlled her. She felt able to step outside of herself, to offer love even in moments of hurt, to rise above the fragile instincts of childhood. The grace was so swift and profound that she compared it to the way Jesus transformed his disciples with a single look or a single word. She felt as though she had been reborn, not physically but spiritually. Something within her had opened like a flower at dawn, strengthened not by her own will but by God's tender mercy. This moment, known in her life as the Christmas grace, became the foundation of her spiritual maturity. It was the moment she stepped decisively out of childhood and into a new, deeper relationship with God. She found herself able to confront difficulties without collapsing. She could bear small humiliations with peace. She could love more freely without fear of losing herself. The nervous trembling that had tormented her gradually disappeared. The tears that once rose at every discomfort gave way to a calm, interior stability. She realized that God had taken her fragile heart into his hands and filled it with strength beyond her own. This transformation showed itself immediately. When she entered the room where her father's remark had been made, she did not react with hurt or sadness. Instead, she smiled, embraced him, and entered wholeheartedly into the joy of Christmas festivities. She laughed easily, spoke cheerfully, and approached the small gifts in her shoes not with childish excitement, but with a new maturity. Her sisters watched in astonishment, sensing that something profound had happened within her. The next day, and in the days that followed, the change only deepened. From that moment onward, Therese felt a renewed fire in her soul. She wanted to give herself entirely to God. She sought opportunities to sacrifice, even in the smallest ways, offering every act with love. She began to pray more fervently, to serve her family with greater patience, and to cultivate an interior silence that welcomed God's presence. Her love for her father grew even more tender, her affection for her sisters more selfless. For the first time, she felt capable of directing her sensibility towards something greater, something eternal. It was as though her heart, once fragile, had discovered the secret of divine strength. Yet this newfound stability did not harden her. It purified her. Instead of being controlled by her emotions, she could now channel them into compassion. She became more attentive to the needs of others, more forgiving, more willing to bear misunderstandings without protest. The grace she received did not make her less sensitive. It made her sensitive in a new way, stronger, freer, more open to love. This was the beginning of the little way, a spirituality defined not by grand gestures, but by the simple offering of daily life, done with love and trust. Her prayer life changed as well. She no longer prayed merely from need or sorrow, but from a deep desire to love God wholeheartedly. She spent quiet moments in contemplation, speaking to Jesus with a familiarity that revealed the intimate relationship blooming in her heart. She began offering little sacrifices, giving up small comforts, accepting inconveniences, or remaining silent when she felt inclined to speak. These were not grand penances, but offerings of love, crafted from the ordinary fabric of daily living. The Christmas grace also lit within her a powerful desire to save souls. The following year, she heard about a convicted murderer named Pranzini, whose fate had become a subject of public discussion. Moved by his hardened heart, she prayed fervently for his repentance. She asked God for a sign that her prayers had been heard. When she learned that, at the moment of his execution, Pranzini had kissed the crucifix placed before him, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She understood then that God had entrusted her with a mission to pray for sinners, to love those far from him, and to become, in her hidden way, a vessel of divine mercy. Thus, the quiet miracle of that Christmas night blossomed into a lifetime of grace. The sensitive child who once trembled under the weight of her emotions had become a young woman strengthened by the gentle touch of God. Her heart, purified by suffering and transformed by love, was now ready to follow wherever he would lead. And as this new strength began to shape her soul, what longing would soon arise within her, a longing so bold it would challenge even the boundaries of her youth. And as this new strength began to shape her soul, what longing would soon arise within her, a longing so bold it would challenge even the boundaries of her youth. In the quiet months following the Christmas grace, a deep and luminous desire began to germinate in the heart of young Thérèse. It did not emerge suddenly, nor with intensity at first, but rather like the slow brightening of dawn that transforms the sky long before the sun fully rises. Something within her, awakened by grace, began to reach toward God in a way that surpassed simple devotion. She sensed, almost before she could speak it aloud, that her life belonged entirely to him. Every joy, every sorrow, every small act of love seemed to trace the outline of a calling she had not yet dared to name. But one day that calling would reveal itself with unmistakable clarity. She was being drawn to Carmel. At 13 and 14, while other girls might daydream about friendships, future homes, or the unfolding delights of youth, Thérèse found her imagination captivated by the life of the Carmelites, those hidden women who lived behind the grille of the Lisieux convent. She had known about them for years, of course, for Pauline, now Sister Agnes of Jesus, was among them. But after the Christmas grace, her sense of attraction deepened. She would often accompany her father on visits, speaking to Pauline through the wooden bars that separated cloister from world, and each time she felt an almost magnetic pull toward that sacred enclosure. Something inside her whispered, "This is where you belong." Yet she was still so young, still outwardly a child, that she scarcely dared admit the longing to anyone but God. During this time, her interior life blossomed. She prayed with a fervor that surprised even her older sisters. Her desire to love God grew into a quiet flame that warmed her every thought. She felt compelled to give him not a portion of herself, but everything. The world, with all its charms, seemed pale in comparison to the hidden life of love she envisioned within Carmel. She longed for silence, for prayer, for the chance to offer every moment solely to God's glory. But the very depth of this desire left her feeling both exhilarated and humbled. How could a girl of 15, still small in stature and youthful in appearance, believe herself called to a monastic life reserved for mature women? Her father, Louis, noticed the deepening seriousness in her demeanor. He watched her pray with growing devotion. He saw her heart open more fully to God each day, and though he cherished her dearly, calling her his little queen, he began to sense that God was asking him to make a sacrifice as profound as the one Abraham once made. But he also understood that such a decision could not be rushed. The church, after all, did not admit girls of her age into the cloister, and so he waited, watching with both love and concern as his youngest daughter's desire for religious life grew more radiant with each passing month. Meanwhile, Thérèse sought guidance from Pauline during their visits. Through the grille, she confided her longing to join Carmel, explaining that she felt unable to wait until the customary age of 20. Pauline, both touched and cautious, encouraged her to continue praying, to seek God's timing rather than her own, and to trust that if the desire came from him, it would not be thwarted. Her words comforted Thérèse, but they also deepened her resolve. The longing only intensified. filling her heart like a stream that could no longer be contained. One day, after much prayer and trembling hope, Therese approached her father with a request that must have cost her more courage than any previously asked of her. She invited him for a walk through the blooming garden behind their home in Les Buissonnets. There, under the soft light of afternoon, she revealed the desire of her heart. She wanted to enter Carmel, not later, but now, at 15. Louis, surprised and deeply moved, looked at her with a tenderness that reflected both love and recognition of the seriousness of her request. He did not dismiss her words as childish fantasy. Instead, he gazed at her with a father's intuition, realizing that this longing was no fleeting impulse, but a genuine call rooted in grace. In an act of profound faith and surrender, he knelt beside her, took up a small white flower blooming nearby, and plucked it from the earth. He offered it to her as a symbol of her own soul, dedicated entirely to God. It was his quiet way of saying yes, even though he knew the cost. From that moment, he committed himself to supporting her vocation, even though it meant giving up the daughter who had been his joy and companion. But the road to Carmel was not as straightforward as father and daughter hoped. When they approached the superior of the convent, Mother Marie de Gonzague, they encountered hesitation. Thérèse was still considered too young for such a commitment. Her youth, her lingering fragility, and the strict customs surrounding monastic admission all stood as barriers. Yet Thérèse, strengthened by the Christmas grace, refused to be discouraged. She believed that God's will would never be hindered by human limitations. With her father's blessing, she sought further approval from the local bishop, explaining her maturity of soul and the strength of her calling. Even the bishop recognized her sincerity but felt bound by caution. He offered encouragement but not permission. Still, her heart did not waver. If God had planted this desire within her, she would follow it wherever it led, even to Rome itself. Her father, devoted and courageous, agreed to take her there. It was a journey neither of them expected to make, but one that revealed the profound love between them. As they prepared for their pilgrimage to seek Pope Leo's blessing, Thérèse felt herself entering a new phase of her spiritual life, one marked by courage, perseverance, and a willingness to trust God in daring ways. She carried within her heart a promise: if you want me in Carmel, I will go. If you ask me to wait, I will wait. But wherever you lead, I will follow. Thus began the unfolding of one of the most defining chapters of her life, a chapter in which the fragile little girl stepped forward with the fearless heart of a soul consumed by love. And as she set her eyes toward Rome, what courage would she discover within herself? A courage that would speak boldly before the very head of the Church. And as she set her eyes toward Rome, what courage would she discover within herself? A courage that would speak boldly before the very head of the Church. The decision to undertake the great pilgrimage was not made lightly, for such journeys in the late 19th century required both financial sacrifice and physical endurance. Yet Louis Martin, with the serenity of a father whose heart had already been offered to God alongside his child's vocation, agreed without hesitation. To help his youngest daughter seek the Holy Father's permission felt less like an act of daring and more like a continuation of his life's deepest offering. And so arrangements were made: passports, travel plans, lodging, practical matters that carried within them a quiet sense of spiritual expectancy. For Thérèse, the journey was not merely a series of steps across Europe. It was a pilgrimage of trust, a testing and strengthening of the desire that had been steadily growing since childhood. The morning of their departure in November 1887 dawned cold, its pale light sifting through the windows of Les Buissonnets as the family gathered to say farewell. Céline traveled with them, radiant with excitement, but also aware of the gravity of the journey. As the carriage rolled away, Thérèse gazed longingly at her home, not knowing how profoundly this pilgrimage would shape her interior life. She carried within her a single intention, permission to enter Carmel at 15, and her heart rested on that hope as steadily as a flame shielded between two hands. Their route took them first through Paris, where the overwhelming bustle and grandeur stirred in Thérèse both wonder and detachment. She admired the beauty, yet felt it could never satisfy the longing that drove her. From Paris, they traveled by train through Switzerland, where the majesty of the mountains filled her with awe. The snow-capped peaks, glistening lakes, and sheer cliffs reminded her of the greatness of God, and often she would murmur to herself the psalms of creation, letting the sights become a kind of prayer. But even these wonders, dazzling as they were, could not distract her from the central purpose of the journey. Her heart remained fixed on the hope of speaking to the Holy Father. Traveling with a diocesan group, they visited shrines, churches, and sacred sites along the way. Though she enjoyed these moments, Thérèse found herself moved most deeply by the simple encounters with people: pilgrims, travelers, elderly women offering small blessings, children who smiled at her with curious eyes. She carried a tenderness for souls that made her more attentive to others than to monuments. On one occasion, when a poor man approached their group seeking alms, Thérèse slipped him a coin and a smile, recalling the story of the prodigal son and imagining that every unfamiliar face might be Christ himself in disguise. When at last they arrived in Italy, her heart began to race with a mixture of hope and nervous anticipation. Rome, with its ancient stones and soaring basilicas, seemed to her like the physical echo of centuries of faith. Yet even as she marveled at the city's beauty, she remained inwardly focused. Her longing to belong to Carmel had now grown into a bold determination. She knew that without extraordinary permission from Pope Leo XIII, she would have to wait 5 more years before entering the cloister, and her soul felt unable to bear such delay. Each day in Rome was filled with visits to sacred sites: the Colosseum, where the early martyrs had shed their blood, the catacombs whose silent corridors held whisperings of ancient faith, the basilicas dedicated to saints whose courage and holiness stirred her imagination. But the most significant moment awaited her at the audience with the Pope. As the day approached, she felt torn between reverence and boldness. Could she truly speak to the Holy Father, break protocol, and plead her cause? On the morning of the audience, she dressed carefully, choosing simplicity rather than adornment. She wanted nothing to distract from her request. When they arrived at the Vatican, the grandeur of the palace overwhelmed her senses. The marble floors, gilded ceilings, and procession of dignitaries created an atmosphere of awe, but her mind remained fixed on her intention. She prayed silently. "Lord, give me courage. If this is your will, let the Holy Father hear my plea." One by one, the pilgrims approached Pope Leo XIII. When her turn came, her heart pounded so fiercely she feared her breath might fail her. She knelt, pressing her lips to his slipper in reverence, just as instructed. But instead of rising and moving on, she lifted her gaze and spoke. From a place of sincerity so pure that all protocol dissolved. Her voice, tremulous yet steady, carried a message shaped by both innocence and determination. She begged permission to enter Carmel at 15. The room stilled. A young girl, so small and delicate, breaking tradition to speak directly to the Vicar of Christ. Such boldness was rarely seen. The priests around her attempted to gently pull her away, signaling that she had overstepped. But Thérèse held her ground for one moment more, her eyes fixed on the Pope's face. Pope Leo XIII, elderly and gentle, looked at her with a mixture of astonishment and kindness. He did not grant her request immediately. Custom and caution held him back. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder and spoke words that would echo in her heart for years. "If it is God's will, you shall enter." These words, simple as they were, planted a seed of hope within her. She was disappointed, yet not defeated. She took the Pope's blessing as a sign that the path remained open, awaiting only God's timing. As she stepped back into the crowd, her heart quivered between sorrow and peace. The refusal had stung, but the blessing assured her that God had heard her longing. In the days that followed, she reflected deeply on the moment. She understood that her vocation, like all things rooted in divine love, must unfold not through force but through patience and surrender. And so she returned home, her heart not diminished, but strengthened by the pilgrimage. When she arrived once more at Les Buissonnets, she resumed her daily life with renewed trust. She prayed. She served her family. She waited. What she did not yet know was that her perseverance, her boldness, and her willingness to be guided by grace were already softening the hearts of those who held the decision. The path to Carmel was quietly unfolding behind the scenes, and soon the doors that had seemed closed would open with unexpected tenderness. And as she returned home from Rome, what quiet providence would begin to work in her favor, drawing her ever closer to the cloister of her dreams. And as she returned home from Rome, what quiet providence would begin to work in her favor, drawing her ever closer to the cloister of her dreams. The journey back to Lisieux unfolded with a gentler rhythm than the hopeful outward journey. Thérèse, though still young, had grown in ways that even she did not fully grasp. She had stood before the Holy Father, spoken her heart openly, and accepted with humility the uncertainty of his response. Now, as the familiar landscape of Normandy came into view, she carried within her soul not disappointment, but a deeper trust. She felt, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that her vocation was not hers to achieve, but God's to unfold. And so she stepped once more into the quiet routine of Les Buissonnets, ready to wait with patience, yet burning with a longing that could not be extinguished. Her father, Louis, returned home exhausted in body, but peaceful in spirit. The journey had taken much of his strength, and the early signs of the illness that would later darken his final years began to reveal themselves in subtle ways. But he said nothing of his discomfort, for his joy in supporting Thérèse overshadowed any personal suffering. He believed with the serene faith of a man who had surrendered all to God that if her vocation was truly from heaven, no human obstacle could prevent it. His calm acceptance gave Thérèse renewed courage. She too felt that the outcome no longer depended on argument or persuasion, but on quiet fidelity. And quietly, without noise or spectacle, the tide began to turn. The bishop, moved by her sincerity, reconsidered her request. The Carmel in Lisieux, already home to her sisters Pauline and Marie, also began to feel that perhaps God was calling this young, fervent soul in an extraordinary way. Conversations unfolded gently behind closed doors. Letters were exchanged. Slowly, resistance melted into discernment, and discernment into acceptance. It was as though the Holy Spirit had begun to move hearts in unison, preparing a place for her within the cloister long before she crossed its threshold. Then, one winter evening, quiet, calm, almost unremarkable in outward appearance, a message arrived that would transform the course of her life. Permission was granted. Thérèse could enter Carmel, not at 20, nor 18, nor even 16, but at 15, still as young and small as the little flower, for which she would later be known. When she learned the news, her heart overflowed with a joy so deep, so tender that she could hardly speak. She felt as though God himself had stooped down to lift her gently into his arms, affirming the desire he had planted there from childhood. Her family gathered around her, sharing her joy with tears that mingled sorrow and celebration. For though they rejoiced in her vocation, they also knew that this decision would bring a permanent change. The lively presence of the youngest Martin, the beloved little queen, would soon be removed from their home. And yet, in the strange mystery of faith, love made the sacrifice not only bearable but beautiful. They cherished her final days with them like petals pressed between the pages of a treasured book. The time came at last, April 9, 1888. Spring had begun to soften the world with tender green, and the air carried the faint fragrance of blossoms, signs she would later interpret as symbols of God's promise. That morning, dressed humbly and accompanied by her father, Thérèse walked toward the Carmel of Lisieux with steps that were steady yet trembling with awe. Her heart, though full of longing, carried also a quiet fear. She had never lived away from her home. She had never known the silence of the cloister except from the visitor's side of the grill. But she felt more deeply than fear that she was being led by love itself. Louis walked beside her with touching dignity, though tears glistened in his eyes. At one point he paused, took her hand, and pressed it gently to his lips. Then, with a gesture she would remember for the rest of her life, he lifted a small bouquet of flowers and offered it to her, saying, "Go, my little queen." It was not merely a farewell, but an act of profound surrender, a father giving his dearest child back to God. When they reached the Carmel gate, the heavy wooden door opened with solemn slowness. The nuns stood waiting in silence. Thérèse, her heart pounding, stepped into the threshold. She turned briefly to look at her father, their eyes meeting in one final exchange of earthly closeness before the door closed behind her. That sound, the deep, echoing thud of the door, marked the beginning of a new life, one hidden from the world, one offered entirely to God. Inside the cloister, she was greeted with kindness and reverence. The mother prioress welcomed her warmly, and her sisters Pauline and Marie, now clothed in sacraments rather than familial ties, embraced her with a delicate joy. But even in these first moments of celebration, a truth became clear. Carmel was not a refuge for sensitive hearts seeking comfort. It was a place of prayer, sacrifice, humility, and discipline. Its silence was profound, its schedule strict, its daily life structured around surrender. Thérèse felt both exhilarated and sobered. The romantic vision she had held of religious life quickly gave way to the reality of its demands. She would rise early, work diligently, pray often, and accept, without seeking attention, the small trials that shaped each day. She understood that her life in Carmel would require more than fervor. It would require endurance and generosity. Her first nights within the convent were filled with a mixture of peace and adjustment. The silence, once so alluring, felt heavy at times. The wooden bed was hard. The cell was small and bare, furnished with little more than necessity. The prayers were long, and the manual labor required strength she did not always feel. Yet she offered each difficulty to God with a sweetness that revealed the depth of her calling. It was not ease she sought, but love, and love, she knew, grows best when refined by sacrifice. Slowly, day by day, she learned the rhythm of Carmel. She swept corridors, prayed in the choir, studied scripture, and embraced the obscurity of hidden life. She found joy in small tasks, like folding laundry or tending the chapel linens, reminding herself that no act was too small to offer to God. She loved her sisters deeply, though she soon discovered that community life brought its own share of challenges, misunderstandings, differences in personality, moments of friction. Yet these, too, she welcomed as opportunities to practice charity. Her heart, though young, was learning a wisdom that many take a lifetime to grasp. Holiness is not found in extraordinary deeds, but in the faithful offering of ordinary moments. As weeks turned to months, and months edged toward her religious profession, a serene certainty settled within her. She belonged here, not because she was perfect or strong, but because she was willing to love in small, hidden ways, pouring herself out like a quiet stream that nourishes without noise. And as she embraced the hidden discipline of Carmel, what new understanding of love would begin to blossom within her, shaping the path she would one day offer to the entire world? And as she embraced the hidden discipline of Carmel, what new understanding of love would begin to blossom within her, shaping the path she would one day offer to the entire world? In the early years of her religious life, Therese found herself standing at a profound threshold. She had arrived in Carmel with a heart aflame, ready to give everything, ready to pour out every drop of love she possessed. Yet once the initial glow softened and the routine of cloistered life settled into her days, she discovered the deeper truth of what it meant to belong entirely to God. She realized that the vocation she had longed for so intensely was not a romantic refuge, nor a sanctuary from the struggles of the world. It was instead a narrow path of simplicity and surrender, carved into the ordinary folds of daily living. And it was upon this quiet path that her little way would slowly, beautifully, and almost imperceptibly unfold. Carmel, with its unadorned corridors and echoing silence, became the classroom where grace taught her to see differently. The world outside treasured grand achievements, heroic sacrifices, and visible saintliness. But within the cloister, Therese encountered the humbler truth that most souls are not called to dramatic feats. Most are invited instead to sanctify the small, fleeting moments that pass unnoticed by others. Rising in the cold before dawn, folding laundry with attentive care, sweeping dusty floors, enduring small irritations or misunderstandings without complaint, these became the raw material of her holiness. And though such tasks seemed insignificant, she realized that love infused into them could transform them into offerings of immeasurable worth. At first, the simplicity of this hidden way felt almost too small for her longing. There were moments when she wished she could do something truly heroic for God, something that would prove the depth of her devotion. But gradually, she came to understand that the greatness God desired was not rooted in visible deeds, but in purity of intention. He looked not at the scale of the action, but at the love behind it. This realization freed her. She no longer needed to strive for what lay beyond her reach. She needed only to offer her smallness, her limitations, her daily tasks, and her inner struggles. In doing so, she entered a freedom deeper than anything she had imagined. Living in community sharpened this understanding. Among her sisters, each with different temperaments and backgrounds, she learned that love must be practical. It must express itself not only in prayer, but in kindness, patience, and gentleness. She began to notice how small gestures, an encouraging look, a withheld criticism, a silent act of service, could ease another's burden. There was one sister in particular whose temperament clashed with hers. This nun often acted brusquely, correcting Therese unnecessarily and offering little warmth in return. Instead of avoiding her, Therese chose to love her intentionally. She offered her bright smiles, small acts of help, and prayers offered in secret. She treated her as though she were her dearest friend, even though her natural inclinations pushed her toward avoidance. Later, the sister confessed she believed Therese had a special affection for her, never realizing the ongoing sacrifice it required. Through this simple yet profound practice, Therese discovered that charity was not a feeling, but an act of the will, a decision to love even when the heart feels nothing. Her inner life deepened through contemplation as well. She spent long hours in the chapel, often feeling nothing emotionally, yet offering her steadfast presence to the one she loved. She contemplated Jesus in his hidden life, 30 years of obscurity before his public ministry, and found in his humility the perfect model for her own. She imagined him working quietly in Nazareth, performing simple tasks, obeying his parents, living in anonymity. If the Son of God embraced such smallness, how could she not do the same? This image anchored her spirituality, teaching her that true holiness often blooms unseen. During this period, she was given permission to write spiritual reflections and poems, and though she did not yet know it, these writings would one day touch millions. In these early pages, the seeds of her little way began to appear, glimmers of a path marked not by ascetic extremes, but by trust, surrender, and childlike confidence. She wrote of her desire to be little before God, like a child lifted into his arms. She wrote of her conviction that God is not impressed by human achievements, but moved by humble trust. She wrote of her desire to scatter flowers before Jesus, little sacrifices, hidden acts of love, moments offered with joy. These writings were not meant to impress. They were simply the outpouring of her soul. One of the deepest realizations of her early years in Carmel was her discovery of her vocation within her vocation. Meditating on St. Paul's teaching about the body of Christ, she longed to understand her place within it. Some were apostles, some prophets, some teachers. But where did she belong? After long reflection and prayer, she arrived at a truth that filled her with overwhelming joy. Her vocation was to be love, to be the heart of the church, not its strength, not its voice, not its intellect, its beating, hidden heart. A heart unseen, yet necessary for life to flow through the body. This understanding illuminated her entire spirituality. Her life, with all its hidden sacrifices and small acts, would become a channel of love within the church. It was in these years that she composed the foundational lines of her offering to merciful love, a prayer that revealed the depth of her trust in God's goodness. She did not offer herself to divine justice out of fear, as some spiritual traditions emphasized, but to divine mercy out of love. She desired not to avoid suffering, but to use her suffering, whatever form it might take, to draw closer to Jesus and to help save souls. Her offering was not dramatic, but quiet, whispered in the depth of her heart. Yet its impact would one day be immense. Still, her path was not without challenges. She suffered periods of spiritual dryness, moments when she felt distant from God, times when prayer felt heavy. She battled her own imperfections, especially her desire to be seen as good by others. But each struggle became another opportunity to practice her little way. When she fell, she rose again. When she felt nothing, she trusted. When she struggled, she surrendered. Little by little, she learned to love not by effort alone, but by grace flowing through her in ways she often did not perceive. As her second year in Carmel drew to a close, her little way had taken shape, not through visions or miracles, but through the quiet fidelity of daily life. It was a spirituality that welcomed imperfection, embraced simplicity, and leaned wholly on God's love. She did not know that one day this path would spread across the world, or that countless souls would follow her example. She simply lived, loved, prayed, and offered herself moment by moment. And as her little way opened before her like a path of soft petals, what hidden trials would soon challenge her love and refine it in ways she could not yet imagine? And as her little way opened before her like a path of soft petals, what hidden trials would soon challenge her love and refine it in ways she could not yet imagine? Although her early years in Carmel were filled with tender growth and spiritual clarity, Therese was about to enter a phase of life marked not by consolations, but by a deeper interior struggle. These trials did not come as dramatic storms or visible hardships. Rather, they arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly, slipping into the corners of her days like shadows creeping across a room. But as with all saints whose sanctity is forged in secret, these small shadows became the crucible in which her little way was purified. They revealed the cost of love when love must persist without reward. The first kind of trial she faced was spiritual dryness. After the fervent years of youthful devotion and the clarity of her early calling, she now discovered that prayer could become barren, its sweetness withdrawn. Moments that once filled her with warmth now felt empty. And yet, day after day, she returned to the choir, to her hours of contemplation, forcing herself to remain before God with nothing but her faith to sustain her. She would later write that she often felt as though heaven had closed its doors, leaving her to pray in darkness. But rather than despairing, she embraced this dryness as an opportunity to love Jesus not for the comfort he gave, but for himself alone. If prayer no longer stirred her emotions, she offered him her fidelity. If she felt nothing, she offered him her emptiness. She understood that love, to be real, must endure in silence. Another trial came through her interactions within the community. Though Carmel was a place of holiness, it was also a place where ordinary human frailties lived side by side with grace. Personalities clashed, misunderstandings arose, and small tensions flickered through the convent like sparks that refused to die. There were sisters whose tempers were quick, whose judgments were sharp, and whose presence tested her patience. One sister in particular, a woman with a difficult temperament and a tendency to be critical, became a source of steady irritation. The smallest act of Therese seemed to draw her disapproval. Yet instead of reacting or withdrawing, Therese made a conscious decision to love her more intentionally. She greeted her with a bright smile, offered her assistance before she asked, and silently prayed for her peace. She treated her with such genuine kindness that the sister once confessed she did not understand why Therese held such affection for her. The truth, known only to God, was that every gesture toward her was an act of sacrifice. But the trial that left the deepest mark on her heart during this period came from witnessing her father's suffering. The gentle, noble man who had supported her vocation now faced the slow and painful decline of mental illness. News arrived that Louis had begun behaving strangely, wandering from home, forgetting familiar things, and exhibiting signs of confusion that frightened his loved ones. Eventually, he had to be placed in a medical facility for care. For Therese, the anguish was profound. She who had leaned on his spiritual strength now felt helpless to ease his torment. She cried in secret, praying for grace to accept this heavy burden. Yet she refused to let sorrow darken her trust. She believed that God was sanctifying her father through suffering, just as he sanctified souls in the cloister. And so she carried this trial not with bitterness, but with compassion, offering it as part of her hidden sacrifice. Her physical health also began to ebb. Though still young, she suffered from persistent headaches, fatigue, and a frailty that often made her daily tasks difficult. She never complained, never sought special treatment. She preferred to remain unnoticed, blending into the rhythm of the community like a small flower hidden among the stones. But each effort she made carried within it a silent offering. For love of you, Jesus. These whispered prayers became her strength, steadying her soul even when her body felt weak. The emotional and spiritual trials were accompanied by inward temptations that unsettled her. She struggled occasionally with doubts, not doubts about God's existence, but doubts about her own worthiness, doubts about whether she truly pleased God. At times she feared that her little offerings were too small to matter, but she always returned to the conviction that God did not measure greatness by the scale of the act, but by the love behind it. And so she clung to the simplicity of trust. When doubts whispered that she was unworthy, she answered them with childlike confidence. It is because I am weak that I need God's mercy all the more. So, perhaps the most striking trial of this period was her growing awareness of her own imperfections. She recognized her tendency to seek approval, her desire to be liked, her inclination to avoid discomfort. Seeing these weaknesses could have discouraged her, but instead they led her to a deeper humility. She realized that sainthood did not mean being flawless, but being willing to let God work through one's flaws. And so she offered even her imperfections as gifts, trusting that grace would transform them. One evening, after a particularly difficult day filled with misunderstandings and spiritual dryness, she sat before the tabernacle and whispered a prayer that summarized her entire little way. My Jesus, I can do nothing, but you can do everything. Take my little efforts and make them pleasing to you. This prayer of surrender became her refuge. Whenever she felt overwhelmed by her trials, she returned to this simple offering, finding in it a peace deeper than anything she could achieve by her own strength. Through all these hidden sacrifices, her love grew stronger, quieter, purer. She learned to embrace the unnoticed spaces of life, offering every breath as a gift. She discovered that even the smallest acts, picking up a fallen pin, swallowing a sharp retort, enduring boredom during long chants, could become acts of heroic love when offered with trust. Her little way was not an escape from suffering, but a transformation of it. She believed that God did not ask for greatness, but for willingness, not for brilliance, but for fidelity. And so she learned to give cheerfully, to love quietly, to surrender continually. By the end of this period of hidden trials, she had matured into a woman whose soul radiated peace, even when she felt none. Her sisters noticed her calm presence, her gentle smile, her unwavering patience. Many assumed she lived in constant joy, never knowing the struggles she carried in silence. And this, she believed, was the essence of her vocation: to be little, to be hidden, to love, with a heart purified by gentle suffering. And as these quiet sacrifices deepened the roots of her soul, what new horizon of love would open before her, drawing her compassion beyond the cloister walls to embrace the whole world of souls in need. And as these quiet sacrifices deepened the roots of her soul, what new horizon of love would open before her, drawing her compassion beyond the cloister walls to embrace the whole world of souls in need. Up to this point, Therese's spiritual life had unfolded primarily within the intimate circle of her family, her community, and the silent interior spaces where her soul conversed with God. But now, as she emerged from the shadowed period of hidden trials, her heart began to widen with a new and expansive tenderness. It was as though God was stretching her love beyond the boundaries of the convent, inviting her into a spiritual motherhood that embraced not just the sisters around her, but countless souls she had never met. The quiet pain of her earlier struggles had softened her heart, making it supple, receptive, eager to pour itself out for others. And in this widening horizon, she discovered a calling deeper than she had yet imagined: the mission to love, pray for, and spiritually accompany souls across the world. This awakening was not sudden but unfolded gradually, like dawn creeping across a quiet valley. It began with a series of small events: letters from missionaries, requests for prayers, invitations to intercede for those suffering far beyond France. Whenever she heard of a soul in danger, or a priest struggling in his vocation, or a sinner far from God, something stirred within her. She felt a rush of compassion, a longing to help. She experienced this not as a burden, but as a joy, for her heart recognized these distant souls as her brothers and sisters. She believed that love, when pure, knows no distance. And so, despite the walls of Carmel surrounding her, she felt her heart reaching outward, stretching across oceans and continents. Her devotion to missionaries in particular became a defining feature of this period. The Carmelite tradition had long included prayer for those who worked in distant lands, and Therese embraced this mission with a fervor that astonished even her sisters. She longed to be a missionary herself, not in the physical sense, traveling, preaching, baptizing, but in the spiritual sense, supporting their efforts through prayer, sacrifice, and hidden acts of love. She imagined her little sacrifices, her silence, her patience, her willingness to bear small inconveniences, becoming invisible fuel that strengthened those who labored in difficult mission fields. She felt herself united to them, offering each small act as a way of carrying a corner of their burden. The depth of her spiritual motherhood became especially clear when she was assigned 2 missionary priests to pray for. She embraced this responsibility with tender seriousness. She prayed for them by name, offering not just general prayers but specific intentions: courage, holiness, perseverance, consolation in loneliness. She saw her prayers as threads woven silently into their lives, strengthening them without their knowledge. Her love for them did not depend on knowing their personalities, their challenges, or even the details of their work. It was enough for her that God had entrusted them to her heart. She carried them in prayer the way a mother carries her children, gently, consistently, unconditionally. This spiritual motherhood extended further still, touching the souls of sinners. Her earlier experience praying for Pranzini, the condemned criminal whose last-minute repentance had confirmed the power of her prayers, remained a bright flame within her. She saw in that event a sign of her mission. God had used her small, hidden intercession to save a soul at the brink of despair. This event convinced her that no sin was too great for God's mercy, and that her role, in her littleness, was to plead for that mercy on behalf of others. She longed to comfort those who felt unworthy of God, to whisper through her prayers that forgiveness was always possible. Each sinner, each soul wandering far from grace, became an object of her tender compassion. Her writings from this period reveal a rich and expansive theology of love. She wrote of wanting to sit at the table of sinners, not to condone their actions, but to reassure them of God's tenderness. She longed to be present, mystically, through prayer, at the bedside of the dying, whispering in their hearts the truth of divine mercy. She felt called to offer her own small sufferings for the healing of others. She believed that love expands the heart until it becomes capable of embracing the whole world. During these years, her reflections on St. Paul's teaching about the body of Christ deepened further. She meditated on the idea that every soul plays a unique role, and she longed to understand her place within the divine design. After much prayer, she experienced what she later described as a revelation. Her vocation was to be love within the heart of the Church, love not in the abstract, but love that acted, suffered, interceded, and embraced. This discovery filled her with overwhelming joy. She had found the meaning of her life. She understood that the heart of the Church, like the human heart, pumps life through the entire body. And just as the heart works in silence, unseen yet essential, so too would her love work, unseen yet powerful. She longed to pour herself out completely, to be consumed like a candle, whose sole purpose is to give light. And though she could not travel or preach, her little way allowed her to reach souls across the world. Each small sacrifice, each act of patience, each hidden gesture became a drop of love falling into the ocean of God's mercy. She imagined these drops rippling outward, touching souls she would never meet. During community life, she continued to practice this interior mission. She helped the novices with tenderness, guiding them gently through their struggles. Though she was young, her inner maturity made her a source of quiet strength. When a sister felt discouraged, she offered a smile or a word of comfort. When tempers flared or misunderstandings arose, she silently offered these moments to God as prayers for those who had no one to pray for them. Her compassion extended to those within her own family as well. Her father's increasing decline weighed heavily on her heart, and she prayed continually for his peace. She sensed that her prayers were mysteriously united to his suffering, forming a hidden bond that transcended physical separation. Even from the cloister, she accompanied him, trusting that God used her intercessions to bring him moments of grace. As her love widened, so did her longing to give more. She wanted to offer everything, her prayers, her health, her joys, her trials, for souls. She prayed that God would help her love without measure, without expectation, without limit. And though she did not know it yet, her prayer was already being answered. God was preparing her for an even deeper surrender, one that would test the fullness of her love. And as her compassion stretched toward every corner of the world, what quiet shadow would begin to fall upon her life, one that would draw her deeper into the mysterious embrace of suffering love. And as her compassion stretched toward every corner of the world, what quiet shadow would begin to fall upon her life, one that would draw her deeper into the mysterious embrace of suffering love. It began softly, almost imperceptibly, like the faint cooling of air that precedes the first whisper of winter. A small cough here, a moment of breathlessness there, a fatigue that lingered longer than usual, clinging to her limbs even after rest. At first, no one suspected that these delicate signs foretold the final chapter of her earthly journey. Therese herself paid little attention to them. She simply offered each discomfort to God with the same serenity she offered everything. Yet beneath her calm exterior, the illness slowly tightened its hold. The first unmistakable sign came one evening during recreation, when she felt a warm rush in her throat and instinctively swallowed it. Not wanting to draw attention, she excused herself quietly and returned to her cell. There, she realized what had happened. Her handkerchief was stained with bright red blood. For a moment she froze, not out of fear. Death, to her, had always been a friend shadowed in mystery, but out of clarity. She understood instantly with a quiet certainty that tuberculosis had begun its deadly course. Instead of panic, a strange peace washed over her. She gazed at the blood, not with dread, but with a sense of solemn recognition. She whispered a prayer, offering even this new suffering to Jesus, trusting that it came from the same gentle hand that had guided her all her life. At first, she kept the discovery to herself. She did not want to trouble her sisters or disrupt the gentle harmony of the community. But the illness progressed quickly, and soon her weakness could no longer be hidden. Her cough intensified, her pale complexion grew thinner, and her strength diminished. When the others realized the seriousness of her condition, they responded with love, though some could not hide their sorrow. For Thérèse, their concern became yet another opportunity to offer love in return. She downplayed her pain, smiled whenever possible, and insisted that she felt not too bad, even when rising from bed drained her of nearly all her strength. As her condition worsened, she entered a new depth of spiritual maturity. The illness, painful and exhausting, became a kind of school of love. She understood intuitively that suffering, when embraced with trust, could be transformed into a powerful offering for souls. This conviction did not romanticize her pain. It simply infused it with purpose. She never sought suffering for its own sake, but neither did she shrink from it. She accepted it as part of her mission. Every moment of breathlessness, every hour of fever, every pang of loneliness, she offered all of it to God as a silent prayer for those who felt far from Him. The sisters who cared for her witnessed her extraordinary patience. Even as fever burned within her, she refused to complain. She believed that complaints, even small ones, took away the beauty of suffering offered with love. Instead, she whispered short prayers. "My Jesus, I love you. Take all that I have. Help me to be faithful." These gentle invocations became the rhythm of her days. At times, she seemed lost in contemplation, her eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. But at other times, the pain overwhelmed her body and tears filled her eyes. When this happened, she did not try to appear heroic. She simply said, "I am weak, but He is strong." Her honesty made her holiness approachable, human, tender. Her devotion to her missionary priests, whom she considered her spiritual sons, only deepened during this period. She continued to pray for them with fervor, believing that her suffering, accepted with love, could strengthen their hearts and protect their vocations. She would often speak of them as though they were physically present, so vivid was her spiritual connection to them. Her love grew even more expansive, reaching beyond priests to souls everywhere. Men and women, sinners and saints, the lonely, the dying, the forgotten. She felt united to them through her pain, as though every breath she struggled to take became a silent plea for grace on behalf of the world. Despite the growing weakness of her body, her heart remained full of joy, not the exuberant joy of youth, but a deep, steady, luminous joy, rooted in trust. She once said, "Everything is grace." These 3 simple words became the anchor of her final years. She believed that no moment of life was wasted, not even those spent in agony. God, she knew, could transform all things, joys and sorrows alike, into instruments of love. Her relationship with Jesus, always tender, now took on an even more intimate character. She spoke to him with the familiarity of a child speaking to a beloved parent. She told him of her fears, her desires, her exhaustion. She offered him her weakness without shame, believing that he delighted in her littleness. The more her body weakened, the more she leaned into his strength. She felt as though she were being carried, not walking. And this sense of being carried filled her with profound peace. But her illness also brought new trials, trials that tested the very core of her little way. Her nights grew long and restless, her cough tore at her lungs, and her fevers left her drenched in sweat. She often struggled to sleep, her thoughts drifting between prayer and painful awareness of her fragile lungs. The once simple task of breathing became a labor that consumed much of her strength. At times, she experienced moments of acute temptation, temptations to discouragement, to fear, to believe that her sufferings were too great for her small heart. In these moments, she clung all the more firmly to her belief in God's mercy. Her sisters, especially Celine, who had entered Carmel to be near her, watched over her with tenderness. They tried to make her comfortable, adjusting her pillows, bringing her water, cooling her forehead. They loved her not because she was saintly, but because she was their sister, the same girl who once laughed with them in childhood, who had grown into a woman of extraordinary grace. They struggled to accept that she was slipping away before their eyes, but even in their sorrow, they were strengthened by her peace. One evening, as she struggled through a particularly painful coughing fit, she whispered to her sisters, "I am suffering greatly, but I feel peaceful." This sum of her experience, pain mixed with peace, weakness held by grace, became the quiet testimony of her final years. Her illness, though devastating, became the means through which she lived the fullness of her vocation. Through it, she learned to love more deeply, to surrender more completely, and to trust more radically. She had always wanted to be a victim of divine love, wholly consumed by grace. Now, through her suffering, she began to understand what that meant in a way she never had before. And as this illness deepened, what greater darkness would soon envelop her soul, testing even her trust and leading her into one of the most mysterious nights of faith ever known to a saint. And as this illness deepened, what greater darkness would soon envelop her soul, testing even her trust and leading her into one of the most mysterious nights of faith ever known to a saint. Until now, all her trials, her childhood losses, the subtle misunderstandings of community life, the gnawing frailty of her illness, had refined her heart like gentle fire shaping soft gold. Yet through each trial she had remained anchored in the radiant assurance of God's nearness, like a child who feels her father's steady hand guiding her every step. But now, in the final year of her life, a new trial emerged, one not of body, but of spirit. A darkness fell quietly over her faith, a veil that dimmed every sense of the divine presence she had always trusted. It came not with a violent tearing, but like a slow eclipse, in which the bright sun of her soul's certainty was gradually obscured, leaving her in a night with no visible stars. It began, strangely enough, in moments when she felt her deepest longing for heaven. For years, she had lived with an almost childlike expectation of heaven's joy, imagining herself carried by angels into the embrace of God. But now, as her illness progressed and the moment of death inched closer, something within her shifted. Heaven no longer felt near. Instead, a heavy interior fog thickened around her heart. When she tried to pray, she found no warmth. When she whispered the name of Jesus, she felt no answering whisper in return. She felt as though the doors of heaven had been closed, not just to her feelings, but to her understanding. The God she had always known as tender Father now seemed hidden behind an impenetrable wall. This was not doubt in the philosophical sense. She never questioned God's existence or his love for the world, but she was tormented by a psychological darkness that whispered that heaven might not exist for her, that death might mean only silence, emptiness, the extinguishing of all hope. She suffered interior temptations suggesting that everything she had believed might be an illusion designed to comfort the weak. These temptations horrified her, not because she lacked faith, but because she still loved God so deeply that even the thought of separation from him felt like agony. At times, she described her experience as sitting at the table of sinners, sharing in their darkness so that she might help them through compassion rather than judgment. She felt as though she were mysteriously united with atheists, skeptics, and those who had never known God, sharing in their emptiness so that she might understand their suffering more intimately. This strange identification filled her with tenderness for them. She longed to bring them to light, even as she felt wrapped in shadow herself. Yet she did not rebel. She accepted this spiritual night as part of her mission. She believed God allowed it not as punishment, but as participation, an act of solidarity with those who struggled to believe. The darkness affected her prayer life profoundly. Where once she had spoken to God with bubbling affection, now her words felt heavy, her thoughts scattered. She often described prayer as a struggle, a labor performed without consolation. Yet she continued to pray with unwavering fidelity. She returned to her simple invocations, "My Jesus, I love you," even when she perceived no response. She offered God not the joy of her heart, which she could no longer feel, but the bare will that refused to stop believing. This act of faith, stripped of all emotional sweetness, became one of the purest offerings of her life. Her nights in the infirmary were especially difficult. When the fever burned in her body and the coughing tore at her lungs, she felt even more acutely the silence that surrounded her soul. Often she lay awake, wrestling with thoughts of death, not with melodrama, but with a kind of serene resignation touched by sorrow. She imagined the darkness that might follow her final breath, and yet she whispered into that imagined void words of trust she no longer felt. "I will believe." It was not sensation that sustained her now, but choice. The deliberate act of clinging to God even in absolute obscurity. Her sisters, who cared for her daily, had no idea of the depth of her trial. Her face often appeared peaceful, her words kind, her manner serene. She did not speak of her darkness except to her superiors, and even then only when asked. To the outside world, she seemed to radiate quiet courage, and in a certain sense, she did. Her acceptance of this suffering without complaint, her willingness to walk through the night for the sake of others, revealed a strength far greater than the consolations she once enjoyed. In her autobiography, written during this period, she tried to express the nature of her suffering. She wrote of a tunnel in which she could see no light. She described herself as a little soul whose faith is tested by the thickest darkness. She acknowledged that she was tempted to believe that heaven was beyond her reach, and yet she refused to give in to despair. Instead, she saw in this trial the opportunity to love God for his own sake, not for the joy he once gave her. She believed the night purified her love, making it more like God's, faithful, constant, unconditioned by feeling. One of the most striking aspects of this period was her extraordinary gentleness amid suffering. She never allowed her darkness to spill into the lives of others. She welcomed visitors with smiles, laughed softly at small jokes, and offered words of encouragement that astonished those who heard them. When a sister once remarked, "You are so joyful, Sister Thérèse," she responded with simplicity, "I am joyful because I will always want whatever he wants." Even in darkness, she chose love. As her illness worsened, the spiritual night deepened. She felt as though her soul wandered through a vast, cold space where no echo of God returned to her. yet she held on to a single truth. God would not place a desire for heaven in her heart unless He intended to fulfill it. This trust, though no longer felt emotionally, remained firm through sheer determination. She likened herself to a child in the dark who, though frightened, reaches out her hand knowing her father is near even if she cannot see him. Her final months became a profound paradox, her body failing, her spirit purified through darkness, her love deepening even as her faith felt obscured. She lived what she would later inspire in countless souls, the willingness to walk by faith alone, without the support of sight or feeling. This was the culmination of her little way, the offering of not only small acts of love, but the offering of her entire interior life, surrendered into God's hands without reserve. And as this night continued to deepen, what final offering of love would arise from her weakening body and trembling soul, leading her gently toward the moment when her earthly journey would reach its tender end? And as this night continued to deepen, what final offering of love would arise from her weakening body and trembling soul, leading her gently toward the moment when her earthly journey would reach its tender end? The final months of Therese's life unfolded like a slow and sacred descent, not into despair, but into the quiet depths of a love purified by suffering. Her body, once lively and quick to smile, had become frail, its strength ebbing away day by day. Tuberculosis ravaged her lungs, leaving her breathless, feverish, and racked with fits of coughing that tore at her chest and exhausted what little energy she had left. Yet despite the relentless progression of her illness, her soul radiated a kind of luminous gentleness that astonished those who cared for her. She seemed to inhabit a paradox, outwardly fragile, inwardly steadfast, emotionally stripped of consolation, spiritually anchored in surrender. It was as though her entire life had been leading her, quietly and steadily, toward this final act of love. Her nights were the most difficult. The infirmary, dimly lit by the faint glow of a lamp, often echoed with her ragged breathing and the soft rustle of blankets as she struggled to find a position that eased her pain. She could not lie flat. The pressure on her lungs became unbearable. She could not sit upright for long. Her body lacked the strength. And so she rested in a half-reclined position that offered only temporary relief. Every breath cost her effort. Every cough left her trembling. Yet when a sister approached her bed to adjust her pillows or offer a sip of water, Therese would muster a small smile, whispering a gentle word of gratitude. She did not want her suffering to burden others. She wanted, even in her pain, to be a presence of peace. As her illness progressed, her spiritual darkness did not lift. In fact, it grew heavier, stretching across her soul like a long and lonely night with no dawn in sight. She confided only to her superiors that she felt deprived of all heavenly assurance. Yet the more God withdrew all sensible comfort, the more she offered Him her trust. Her faith became an act of pure will, a deliberate choice made moment by moment. She often said she walked not by sight, but by love. And this love, stripped of all feeling, became the very core of her sanctity. She prayed not for relief, but for fidelity. She asked Jesus to make her suffer well, to teach her how to love Him purely even when every trace of His presence seemed to vanish. Her sisters observed her heroic patience with growing awe. They saw her agony, though she tried to hide it, and they felt powerless to ease it. They brought her small comforts, cool cloths for her forehead, broth she could barely swallow, brief moments of fresh air when she was wheeled to the infirmary window. Céline, who had been her companion since childhood, stayed close to her bedside, often sketching her in quiet moments, wanting to preserve the memory of her sister's serene courage. But even Céline could not fathom the spiritual battle taking place within Therese's heart. She saw the outer suffering, but only sensed the inner. In these months, Therese's little way shone with its purest clarity. She was no longer able to perform small acts of service, no longer capable of the hidden sacrifices that had filled her earlier years. Now her littleness was absolute. She could offer nothing but her suffering, and even this she offered with a quiet, childlike tenderness. She told her sisters that she felt too small to climb the steep mountain of holiness. Instead, she simply lifted her arms, trusting that God would carry her, just as a parent lifts a child. This image of spiritual childhood, so simple yet profound, became the heart of her teaching. Her conversations, though brief, became treasures for the community. During moments of lucidity, she spoke with disarming simplicity about trust, humility, and surrender. She insisted that holiness was not reserved for the strong or the extraordinary, but for the weak who dared to trust God completely. She encouraged the novices to be patient with their faults and to lean on God's mercy rather than their own effort. Her words, spoken in a faint whisper, carried a depth of wisdom beyond her years. Many sisters later recalled that just sitting near her bed felt like sitting near a warm fire that enveloped them with peace. As summer turned to autumn, her condition deteriorated significantly. Eating became nearly impossible. Her body grew gaunt, her skin pale and translucent. But her eyes, though often clouded with pain, held a depth of compassion that moved those who looked into them. She no longer sought to hide her suffering. Instead, she offered it visibly, willingly, believing that her pain united her more intimately to the suffering Christ. She saw her illness not as punishment, but as a mysterious gift, an invitation to love more deeply. Her prayer life, though stripped of all consolation, remained steady. She often clutched her crucifix, pressing it to her heart or her lips. She whispered simple prayers. "Jesus, I trust in you. I am Therese of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. Do with me as you will." These phrases became a kind of rhythm, a heartbeat of surrender pulsing through her final days. At times, she spoke of longing for heaven, not as escape from suffering, but as fulfillment of her desire to be united with the one she loved. Yet even in this longing, she accepted the delay, saying gently, "I am not dying. I am entering life." One day, during a particularly intense coughing attack that left her gasping for air, a sister asked if she wanted anything. Gathering what little strength she had, Therese whispered, "I want only to love." These words, simple and soft, encapsulated her entire life. She did not ask for relief or comfort. She asked only for the grace to continue loving through the pain. As her final weeks approached, her nights grew more agonizing. She struggled for breath, her lungs filling with blood, each inhalation a battle. Yet even in these moments of near suffocation, she tried to remain polite, apologizing for the trouble she caused. Her humility became a silent sermon. Her surrender became a living gospel. Her littleness, once a spiritual idea, became a tangible reality. A soul emptied of everything except trust. When the final days of September arrived, she sensed that her hour was near. She whispered to her sisters that she felt her mission from heaven was about to begin. She believed deeply that she would spend her eternity doing good on earth, sending down a shower of roses upon those who asked for her help. Her sisters gathered near her bed, praying softly as they watched her struggle for breath. The room was filled with a solemn peace, a sacred stillness that seemed to gather heaven and earth together in that small infirmary. On the afternoon of September 30th, 1897, her breathing became shallow and rapid. She clutched her crucifix tightly, her gaze fixed upon it. Her face, though strained, grew calm. With one final burst of strength, she whispered the words that crowned her life. "My God, I love you." And then, in a final exhalation, her soul slipped gently into eternity. And as her soul left its fragile shell, what unseen grace began to bloom. What fragrance of heaven would soon spread across the world, touching countless hearts through the little flower's promise of love? And as her soul left its fragile shell, what unseen grace began to bloom? What fragrance of heaven would soon spread across the world, touching countless hearts through the little flower's promise of love? When Therese of the Child Jesus breathed her final words, the small infirmary at the Carmel of Lisieux fell into a profound stillness. Those who stood beside her bed felt both grief and awe, as though the veil between earth and heaven had grown thin enough to tremble at their very breaths. Her sisters wept quietly, their tears not only for the loss of the youngest among them, but for the beauty of the death they had just witnessed. A death so steeped in love, so marked by peace, that it seemed to carry the fragrance of her soul upward like incense, rising in the silence of a chapel. Her body, wasted by illness yet radiant in repose, was laid in the simple coffin prepared for her. The community processed prayerfully behind it, chanting the ancient psalms that had shaped their lives. She had requested no special honors, no elaborate ceremonies, no title beyond that which she bore in life: Sister Thérèse of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. Her funeral unfolded quietly, with the same simplicity she had embraced since her entrance into Carmel. Yet even in this simplicity, something extraordinary seemed to hover around her. Several sisters noted a lightness in the air, a sweetness of atmosphere that did not match the somberness of the procession. It was as though heaven itself had drawn near. She was laid to rest in the small Carmelite cemetery, the wooden cross above her grave etched with her simple name. No crowds gathered then, no pilgrims yet knew her story. She died as she had lived, small, hidden, unnoticed by the world. But this hiddenness, like a seed planted deep within the earth, was about to burst into an astonishing bloom. In the weeks following her death, the sisters began to speak quietly among themselves of a strange consolation that seemed to accompany their prayers. They felt her nearness, not as a ghostly presence, but as a gentle spiritual warmth, like a ray of sun resting on their hearts. One sister reported a sudden interior peace while asking for her intercession. Another found strength in moments of discouragement after whispering her name. Gradually, stories began to circulate among the community. A headache quieted, a sadness lightened, a problem resolved in an unexpectedly gentle way after seeking Therese's help. The sisters, who had known her simplicity intimately, smiled through their tears and whispered that her promise had already begun. That promise, the one she declared in her final days, was bold and audacious. She had said she would spend her heaven doing good on earth, and that she would let fall a shower of roses. This metaphor, so tender and poetic, would soon become the signature of her intercession. For roses, those small symbols of God's beauty, seemed to accompany her graces in ways that defied explanation. People who prayed through her intercession began to report receiving roses unexpectedly, fresh roses left anonymously, rose petals falling in improbable places, the scent of roses appearing in rooms where no flowers had been brought. And these signs, subtle yet powerful, became the earthly echo of her heavenly mission. Her autobiography, Story of a Soul, which she had been commanded to write under obedience, was soon distributed beyond the cloister walls. At first it circulated only among a few convents and families, but its impact was immediate. Those who read her words found in them not the lofty mysticism of a theologian, nor the dramatic revelations of a visionary, but something more intimate. The voice of a childlike soul speaking of God with disarming simplicity, honesty, and tenderness. Readers felt seen, understood, encouraged. Her little way, so rooted in trust, humility, and small acts of love, resonated deeply with ordinary people who longed for holiness but felt overwhelmed by their own limitations. Priests found renewed zeal after reading her reflections on spiritual childhood. Mothers and fathers found comfort in her stories of family love. The sick found strength in her patient acceptance of suffering. Those troubled by doubt found solace in her night of faith. Young people felt drawn to her purity and courage. elderly souls found peace in her words about surrender. In every place her writings reached, hearts were stirred gently, quietly, like embers fanned into flame. News of graces attributed to her intercession spread rapidly. A young soldier reported a miraculous protection in battle after invoking her. A woman suffering from depression found sudden relief after praying through her. A priest struggling with discouragement regained clarity after reading her manuscripts. A nun battling illness found unexpected healing after asking for her prayer. Letters began flooding the Carmel of Lisieux. Letters from across France, then from Europe, then from distant continents. Letters describing graces, conversions, and consolations received through her. The sisters, astonished, realized that the hidden flower they had known, small, gentle, silent, had begun to bloom across the world in ways they could never have imagined. Her mission had indeed begun. The shower of roses she promised was falling, not in petals alone, but in graces sprinkled softly on weary hearts. Within a few years, devotion to her spread with astonishing speed. Pilgrims began visiting her grave, leaving flowers, prayers, and petitions. Many reported leaving with a deep interior peace. Some even spoke of fragrances, scents of roses or lilies that surrounded the grave at unexpected moments. Her resting place, once quiet and lonely, became a wellspring of spiritual comfort. As her fame grew, the Church began a careful examination of her writings and the miracles attributed to her. Her little way was seen as a profound response to the spiritual dryness of the modern world, a path accessible to every soul, regardless of education, strength, or circumstance. The simplicity of her theology, far from shallow, revealed a depth of understanding rooted in Scripture and the tradition of the saints, especially St. John of the Cross and Saint Therese of Avila. By 1910, less than 15 years after her death, requests for her canonization were already being voiced among clergy and laity alike. And as the process began, more miracles surfaced, more testimonies were gathered, and more hearts were touched by her intercession. Her little way had become not only a spirituality, but a movement, a gentle revolution of trust in divine mercy. The roses continued to fall. They fell upon soldiers in muddy trenches, upon missionaries in distant lands, upon mothers praying beside the cradles of their children, upon priests wrestling with loneliness, upon students seeking purpose, upon the sick longing for hope. Her presence, invisible yet intimate, touched souls across generations and continents. And as her fame grew like a rising dawn, what recognition would the Church soon bestow upon this hidden Carmelite, affirming the universal power of the little way she had lived so quietly and loved so deeply? And as her fame grew like a rising dawn, what recognition would the Church soon bestow upon this hidden Carmelite, affirming the universal power of the little way she had lived so quietly and loved so deeply? The years that followed Therese's passing unfolded with a kind of quiet wonder, as though heaven itself had gently tilted toward earth, letting her presence filter softly into the lives of countless souls. What had begun as a trickle of devotion soon became a longing, shared across nations. The desire to know the girl who promised roses, the young nun who had lived unseen, yet touched hearts like a warm breeze brushing through an open window. Her mission, once bound to the hidden walls of the Lisieux Carmel, now extended to every corner of the world, its speed and breadth a testament not to human enthusiasm, but to a grace that moved with the freedom of wind through trees. As the early decades of the 20th century unfolded, the Church took careful note of the countless testimonies flowing to Lisieux, stories of conversions, unexpected healings, reconciliations long thought impossible, and quiet interior consolations that seemed to come precisely when souls needed them most. Bishops, priests, mothers, soldiers, teachers, and laborers wrote to the Carmel with trembling gratitude. Some described graces that defied medical explanation. Others spoke of inner peace that had descended unexpectedly after years of turmoil. Many attached roses, pressed, dried, or freshly picked, as signs of her love. It was clear that something extraordinary had begun. A hidden child, who had once called herself a little flower, was now becoming a source of comfort for the entire church. In 1910, the first official steps toward her canonization began. Church authorities compiled testimonies, interviewed witnesses, examined her writings, and studied her humble life with respect and awe. Her autobiography, Story of a Soul, formed the centerpiece of their review. When theologians read it, many were struck by its clarity and depth. They recognized, in her little way, a distillation of the gospel, simple enough for a child to follow, profound enough to challenge the greatest minds. Her reflections on trust, surrender, and spiritual childhood resonated as a remedy for an age marked by anxiety, disillusionment, and spiritual fatigue. And so, the Church moved with cautious care, yet undeniable momentum, toward confirming her sanctity. Her beatification came first in 1923 in a ceremony filled with quiet reverence. Those who attended spoke of an atmosphere almost luminous in its serenity. Then, only 2 years later, in 1925, Pope Pius XI canonized her, one of the youngest saints ever raised to the altars. During the solemn rite in St. Peter's Basilica, voices echoed the grandeur of the proclamation, Saint Thérèse of the Child Jesus and of the Holy Face, a Carmelite hidden behind cloister walls who died at 24 without performing the dramatic works normally associated with sanctity, had now become a universal model of holiness. The Church had recognized that what she offered, a way of love expressed in daily, ordinary faithfulness, was precisely what the modern world needed. But the story did not end with her canonization. In many ways, it had only begun. Pilgrims flocked to Lisieux by the tens of thousands each year, seeking inspiration, healing, and peace. Some arrived carrying heavy burdens, sorrow, illness, regret, and left with lighter hearts. Others came simply to stand at her grave, to whisper a prayer, to ask for a single rose petal of consolation. Her shrine expanded to welcome the growing crowds, and the very town that once knew her as a quiet girl walking with her father now witnessed a river of humanity flowing through its streets. Missions around the world embraced her as their heavenly friend. Priests, especially those serving in remote or difficult locations, felt strengthened, knowing she prayed for them. Her childhood dream of being a missionary, thwarted in life, was now fulfilled in the wide embrace of her heavenly intercession. She who had longed to speak to distant souls now touched them more intimately than she ever could have in bodily travel. Churches bore her name, schools adopted her spirituality, families taught their children her little way as a path of kindness and trust. In 1927, only 2 years after her canonization, she was declared co-patroness of the missions, alongside the great Saint Francis Xavier. The contrast astonished many. He had crossed oceans and continents, baptized tens of thousands, and endured unimaginable hardships. She had crossed the cloister threshold and remained within its walls until her death, and yet they stood together as co-patrons. This pairing revealed something essential, that the greatest missionary is not only the one who travels with eager feet, but also the one who prays with a burning heart. God saw in her the fire of a missionary spirit so intense that no physical limitation could diminish it. Through her, the Church affirmed that love, pure, humble, unconditional love, is the greatest force of evangelization. Her message also found a home in the hearts of ordinary Christians who felt too small, too weak, or too imperfect to aspire to holiness. Many had believed that saintliness was reserved for the strong, the heroic, the extraordinary. But she offered a different vision: holiness accessible to everyone, regardless of abilities or circumstances. She taught that perfection consisted not in grand gestures, but in small acts, done with great love. smiling at someone who annoyed you, enduring frustration patiently, offering a hidden sacrifice, trusting God when all feels uncertain. These, she said, could transform the soul as surely as the austerities practiced by the greatest mystics. As decades passed, her influence did not wane. Instead, it grew. Seminaries taught her spirituality. Popes quoted her extensively. Books about her multiplied, reaching millions. Her relics traveled to nations across the world, drawing crowds who longed for her gentle intercession. And in 1997, on the 100th anniversary of her death, Pope John Paul II bestowed upon her the title of Doctor of the Church, an honor granted to only a few and never before to someone so young, so simple, and so hidden. By this declaration, the Church confirmed the profound theological depth of her little way, recognizing it as a path capable of guiding the faithful in every age. Her legacy continues not as a memory preserved in books or statues, but as a living companionship offered to all who seek a deeper relationship with God. Many who turn to her describe feeling a gentle presence, a quiet encouragement, as though she walks beside them with the ease of a sister or friend. She does not overwhelm. She does not scold. She simply leads souls back to trust in God's mercy, trust in His tenderness, trust in His ability to bring good out of even the smallest offering. Her roses still fall. They fall in hospital rooms where patients pray for strength, in homes where parents worry about their children, in convents where sisters labor quietly in prayer, in prisons where inmates long for forgiveness, in war zones where soldiers seek protection, in churches where faithful hearts whisper her novenas. Her roses fall in subtle ways, in unexpected peace, in sudden clarity, in moments of unlooked-for grace. They remind the world that love, once set ablaze by God, never dies. Her little way remains a light in the modern world, a gentle path guiding souls who feel overwhelmed by life's demands. It is a way that requires no special skill, no extraordinary gifts, only the courage to be small, the willingness to trust, and the desire to love. Through her writings, her intercession, and her enduring presence, Saint Thérèse continues to draw countless hearts into the warm embrace of God's merciful love. And so, her legacy endures, not as a story that ended with her death, but as a quiet river of grace flowing still, reminding each listener that every soul, no matter how small, can become a vessel of love in God's hands,